When a reporter insults Kash Patel, he looks it into his past and gets him in real legal trouble. The air in the press room buzzed with anticipation, a hive of cameras and microphones poised like weapons in a silent war. It was March 28, 2025, and the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. had never felt more like a coliseum. Kash Patel, newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stood at the podium, his dark suit crisp against the backdrop of the FBI seal. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room of reporters, a mix of seasoned veterans and ambitious newcomers eager to make their mark. Among them was Daniel Voss, a 38-year-old investigative journalist for the Capitol Beacon, a publication known for its biting critiques of power. Voss had built his career on exposing corruption, his byline synonymous with scandal. Tall and wiry, with a perpetual smirk and a mop of unkempt brown hair, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Today, he had his sights set on Patel, the controversial Trump loyalist, whose rapid ascent to FBI director had ignited a firestorm of debate. Patel's opening remarks were brief, a terse outline of his vision to restore integrity to the Bureau and root out threats to the American people. His voice was steady, authoritative, a man accustomed to command, but Voss wasn't there to listen, he was there to provoke. As Patel concluded, Voss shot to his feet, his hand raised like a spear. "Director Patel," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "your appointment has been called a political hit job by some, a reward for your loyalty to a certain former president, rather than any real qualifications. Care to comment on how a man with no senior law enforcement experience plans to lead the nation's top investigative agency? Or is this just another chapter in your America First fan fiction?" The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. A few reporters exchanged glances, sensing blood in the water. Patel's jaw tightened, but his expression remained impassive. He leaned forward slightly, fixing Voss with a stare that could cut glass. "Mr. Voss," Patel replied, his voice low and deliberate, "I've spent my career exposing corruption and defending justice. Work I suspect you'd claim to understand, though your track record suggests otherwise. My qualifications are in my results, not your headlines." Next question. The rebuke was sharp, but Voss wasn't deterred. He smirked, scribbling in his notebook as if he'd scored a point. To him, this was a game, a chance to cement his reputation as the reporter who took down the Trump enforcer. Little did he know, the game was about to change. Hours after the press conference, Patel sat in his office on the 7th floor, the city skyline a muted gray through the bulletproof windows. The exchange with Voss lingered in his mind, not because it stung, but because it was predictable. Reporters like Voss thrived on provocation, but Patel had bigger battles to fight. His desk was cluttered with files, gang networks, drug trafficking, national security threats. The FBI was his to reshape, and he intended to do it his way. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Special Agent Maria Torres, seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped inside. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes carried the weight of years in the field. "Sir," she said, holding a tablet, "we've got something. A tip came in an hour ago. Anonymous, but credible. It's about Daniel Voss." Patel raised an eyebrow. "The reporter?" Torres nodded. "The tip claims he's involved in something dirty. Sex trafficking, specifically. Allegations say he's been using his position to cover his tracks, exploiting sources and victims for years. There's a location tied to it, a warehouse in Anacostia. We're cross-referencing now, but it's moving fast." Patel leaned back, processing the information. He'd dealt with enough liars to know when to trust his gut, and this felt real. "How solid is it?" "Solid enough," Torres replied. "We've got financial records from an offshore account linked to Voss popping up in a separate investigation. Plus the tip included a photo, grainy, but it's him meeting with known traffickers. If we move now, we might catch him in the act." Patel's mind raced. Voss's insult had been a minor annoyance, but this was something else, a chance to strike at corruption in a way that sent a message. "Get a team ready," he said. "No leaks. If this is true, we take him down clean." The night was cold, the Anacostia River a black ribbon cutting through the industrial sprawl. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior hiding whatever sins lay within. Patel stood with Torres and a tactical team, their breath visible in the chill air. He'd insisted on being there, not just to oversee, but to see it through. This was personal now. The team moved silently, breaching the side entrance with precision. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear. Crates lined the walls, some stamped with innocuous labels, electronics, clothing, but others held darker cargo. In a back room illuminated by a flickering bulb, they found what they'd come for. Voss's boar's there, his smirk gone, replaced by a frantic scramble as he barked orders at two men loading a van. Beside him, a group of women, young, disheveled, their eyes hollow with despair, huddled against the wall. The sight hit Patel like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a story, it was a nightmare. FBI, hands up. Torres shouted, her weapon trained on Voss. The room erupted into chaos as the men reached for guns, but the tactical team was faster. Shots rang out, brief and controlled, and the traffickers hit the floor, wounded but alive. Voss froze, his hands trembling as he raised them. Patel stepped forward, his presence a quiet storm. Daniel Voss, he said, his voice cutting through the din. You're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, and anything else we dig up. You've got the right to remain silent. Voss's face twisted with rage and disbelief. This is a setup. You're framing me, Patel. You can't handle the truth, so you plant this. Save it, Patel snapped, nodding to Torres. Cuff him. As the agents secured the scene, Patel approached the women, his tone softening. You're safe now. We're getting you out of here. Their gratitude was silent, etched in tear-streaked faces, and it fueled him more than any press conference ever could. The next morning, the story broke like a tidal wave crashing over a brittle shore, flooding every news outlet from cable networks to social media feeds. The Capitol Beacon, Voss's once proud platform, scrambled to distance itself from the disgraced reporter, issuing a frantic statement condemning his actions and claiming ignorance of his crimes. But the damage was irreparable. Readers abandoned the paper in droves, advertisers pulled funding, and the brand's reputation sank into the mire of scandal. Evidence poured in with relentless force, a deluge that drowned any hope of Voss's redemption. Financial trails traced through shadowy offshore accounts revealed payments to known traffickers, encrypted messages on his phone outlined gruesome transactions, and a laptop seized from the Anacostia warehouse held videos too horrific to describe. Digital proof of a depravity that turned stomachs and silenced doubters. The anonymous tip had been the key that unlocked this nightmare. But it was Voss's own hubris, his unshakable belief in his untouchability, that had built the cage now snapping shut around him. In a holding cell beneath the fluorescent glare of FBI headquarters, Daniel Voss sat slumped on a metal bench, his once sharp features dulled by exhaustion and defeat. The bravado that had fueled his career, the swaggering confidence of a man who thought he could outwit anyone, was shattered, leaving behind a husk in a rumpled suit. The cell was stark, its gray walls unyielding, the air heavy with the faint tang of disinfectant and despair. Kash Patel entered, his footsteps deliberate, flanked by Special Agent Maria Torres, whose steady presence was a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing in the room. Patel set a thick manila folder on the steel table with a soft thud, the sound reverberating in the confined space. He pulled out a chair, its legs scraping against the concrete floor, and sat, his dark eyes locking onto Voss with an intensity that could pierce steel. You've got a lot to answer for, Patel said, his voice low and measured, each word a stone dropped into still water. Names, dates, clients, everything you've been hiding. Start talking, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see daylight before you're 80. That's the best deal you're getting today. Heels. Voss glared up at him, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. But the defiance in his gaze was hollow. A flickering ember where a fire once roared. You think you're a hero, Patel? He spat, his voice hoarse, cracking at the edges. You're just a thug with a badge, a political hack playing cop. This won't stick. I'll beat it, you'll see. Patel's expression didn't shift, but a faint tightness pulled at his jaw. He opened the folder with deliberate calm, sliding a stack of glossy photos across the table. Voss shaking hands with traffickers in dimly lit backrooms. Voss standing amid crates at the warehouse. Voss living a double life of privilege and predation. It's sticking already, Patel said, his tone cutting through Voss's bluster like a blade. You insulted me yesterday, threw your little tantrum for the cameras. But this is bigger than your ego, bigger than your cheap shot. You preyed on the vulnerable, built your empire on their suffering, and now you're done. The evidence doesn't lie. You do. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. So talk. Or the interrogation stretched into hours, each revelation peeling back layers of Voss's empire. He'd used his reporting as a shield, cultivating sources who doubled as accomplices, silencing victims with threats or payoffs. By noon, he'd given up names, politicians, businessmen, a network that reached further than Patel had imagined. 2 weeks later, the trial of Daniel Voss unfolded like a scripted drama where the ending was never in doubt. The courtroom, a cavernous space of polished wood and muted light, buzzed with the hum of anticipation as the prosecution laid out its case. The evidence was a tidal wave crashing over Voss's crumbling defenses, financial records tracing illicit payments to offshore accounts, encrypted messages detailing his sordid deals, and, most damning, the testimonies of the women he'd exploited. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now rang out with a clarity that left the jury visibly shaken. Voss sat at the defendant's table, his tailored suit wrinkled, his hands fidgeting with a pen that had long since run dry. The arrogance that had defined him, the smirk, the swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who knew the walls were closing in. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, a formality that underscored the weight of the case against him. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts, sex trafficking, racketeering and obstruction of justice, the room erupted in a quiet chaos of gasps and murmurs. Voss didn't react, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's bench. The sentencing followed swiftly, the judge's voice a steady hammer driving nails into Voss's fate. Life without parole. As the gavel fell, 2 bailiffs stepped forward, their movements precise and unyielding. Metal cuffs clicked around Voss's wrists, and he was led away in chains, his once proud smirk replaced by a vacant stare that seemed to look through the world rather than at it. The clank of his shackles echoed in the courtroom, a final note in the symphony of his downfall. Outside the courthouse, Kash Patel stood on the steps, the spring air crisp against his skin, carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms from the tidal basin nearby. The sky was a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the sun cast long shadows across the stone plaza. Reporters swarmed like moths to a flame, their cameras flashing and microphones thrusting forward, but this time, their questions carried a different tone. Gone was the skepticism, the thinly veiled hostility of that press conference 2 weeks prior. Now their voices held a mix of awe and reverence, as if Patel had transformed from a political lightning rod into a figure of almost mythic stature. Director Patel, how does it feel to take down one of your loudest critics? One asked. What's next for the FBI under your leadership? Called another. Patel raised a hand, silencing the clamor with a gesture that radiated quiet authority. It's not about me, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. It's about the women we saved, the justice we delivered. Bush thought he could hide behind his byline, but no one's above the law. Not a reporter, not anyone. That's the message here. He paused, letting the words settle, then turned away, leaving the press to scramble over his every syllable. To them, he'd turned an insult into a takedown, a personal slight into a public victory, a narrative too perfect to resist. But for Patel, it wasn't about Voss. Not really. The man's barbed words at that press conference had been a fleeting annoyance, a mosquito bite compared to the rot Patel had uncovered. This was about the bigger fight, the one he'd signed up for when he took the FBI's helm, to root out corruption, to protect the vulnerable, to prove the Bureau could be a force for good again. Back at the J. Edgar Hoover building, the air inside was cooler, the hum of activity a constant undercurrent as agents moved through the halls. Patel's office on the 7th floor was a fortress of order amid the chaos, files stacked neatly on his desk, a map of D.C. pinned to the wall, a single photo of his family tucked beside a coffee mug, emblazoned with the FBI seal. Special Agent Maria Torres stepped in, her boots clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, the rich aroma a welcome intrusion. Handing one to Patel, she leaned against the edge of his desk, her dark eyes studying him with the familiarity of a partner who'd seen him at his best and worst. "You think he'll appeal?" she asked, her voice low, tinged with the faintest trace of amusement. She'd been there for the raid, the interrogation, the whole unraveling of Voss's empire, and she knew as well as Patel did how airtight the case was. Patel took the coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands as he considered the question. He took a slow sip, savoring the bitter edge, then set the mug down with a quiet thud. "Let him try," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He's got nothing left, no leverage, no allies, no story to spin. The evidence buried him, and those women's testimonies nailed the coffin shut. He's done." His tone was matter of fact, but there was an undercurrent of satisfaction. Not in Voss's defeat, but in the clarity of the win. This wasn't revenge, it was justice, pure and unyielding. Torres nodded, crossing her arms. "Still, it's poetic, isn't it? Guy comes at you in front of the world, and 2 weeks later he's the one in chains. You couldn't write it better." Patel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the city sprawled out below, tapestry of power and secrets. The insult from that press conference lingered in his memory. A spark that had ignited a fire he hadn't anticipated. Voss had stood there, smug and self-righteous, questioning Patel's legitimacy with that sneering America First fan fiction jab. He'd wanted to challenge Patel's authority, to paint him as a fraud, but instead he'd handed Patel the match to burn his own house down. The irony wasn't lost on him, but Patel didn't dwell on it. Voss's words had been a catalyst, nothing more, a pebble tossed into a pond that revealed the monsters lurking beneath. "He exposed himself," Patel said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Not me, all I did was follow the lead." He met Torres's eyes, and for a moment they shared an unspoken understanding, the weight of what they'd accomplished, the lives they'd changed. Patel stood, straightening his tie, his silhouette framed against the window. He was taller now, not in stature, but in presence. A man who'd taken the reins of a fractured agency and begun to forge something new. The boss had been a chapter, a loud and messy one, but Patel knew this was just the beginning. There were bigger battles ahead, deeper shadows to chase, and he was ready for them all. The story of Daniel Voss became a cautionary tale whispered in newsrooms and FBI corridors alike. Kash Patel's reputation grew, not as a political puppet, but as a relentless force against corruption. The women rescued from the warehouse found new lives, their voices reclaimed, while Voss faded into obscurity, a titan felled by his own sins. For Patel, it was a reminder. Power wasn't in the title but in the action, and he had only just begun.